Good evening, and my turn to thank the organizers for their invitation, but also I would say to praise their admirable courage in organizing this conference in Germany. I mean, we all know, I think we all know, the courage it takes to do that. So many thanks for this. My starting point is the fact that nowadays there's a tendency to regard European Jews as white people. I'll give some examples of, very recent examples of that, but I think it should be obvious that, I mean, not only someone like Netanyahu would regard himself as part of the white people, but probably the whitest of the white, given the kind of collaboration he has with white supremacists in the United States without any problem. And this flies, I mean, in the face of the fact that for most of the history of European Jews, they were regarded as alien in Europe. They were regarded as Hebrews. They were called Hebrews very currently, along being called Jewish. And in the Italian language, they are still Hebrews, right? Hebrew. And that is the bulk of that history, which started changing in the 19th century, as we all know, with the emancipation and assimilation of Jews in Western Europe. So what did lead to the reversal of this process that started in the 19th century? By the late period, the late part of the 19th century, we all know how this started being completely going in reverse. And here, the key point, I think, is something that we will see in a recurrent way in the times after that, which is the combination of economic crisis and migration. This combination produces xenophobia and racism. In the late 19th century, the Jews were the target of that on the background of the first major crisis of global capitalism, starting in 1873, called in economic history books the Long Depression. And this would coincide with migration of Eastern European Jews to Western Europe and the Americas and North America, fleeing persecution, pogroms, and also misery, poverty. So you had this migration, and this migration is what led to the reversal with the combination of the crisis, the economic crisis, of the emancipation, assimilation process. One of the first to have made this kind of analysis is a young man who died in Auschwitz at the age of 26, but had the time before that, he was caught and died the same year, 1944, to write a book which, I mean, of which the main issue here is this, the point I'm making, whatever other weaknesses there may be in the book, given the conditions under which he wrote it. And his name is Abraham Weinstock, known as Léon. And the book's title, the original one in French, The Materialist Interpretation of the Jewish Question. And indeed, this is a crucial explanation, I would say, of what became known as antisemitism, this reversal of assimilation and the rejection, this xenophobia against the migrants, sometimes contrasted with Jews who were there before them, like British Jews or even German Jews. But generally speaking, you have this general rise of anti-Semitism, which is one of the names of the kind of racism that developed. This is the one that became best known, but it's not the only one. Actually, you have a Nordicist ideology, and that's a major component of the Nazi ideology. A person like Eugen Fischer is a theoretician of Nordicism. It's not exactly the same as Aryanism, which goes to Persia, India, and the rest. And you can see the kind of perception of the Jews that you had in, for instance, the definition of one of the racist theoreticians of Nazism, Hans Günther, defining, I'm quoting here, the largest part of the Jews in North America and a large part of Western European Jewry, look at the scientific language, would be a racial mixture which we may designate as Western Asiatic, Oriental, that means Semitic, East Baltic, that's the only European little window here, Eastern Central Asiatic, Nordic, Eastern Central Asiatic, and Nordic Hamitic Negroid. So that's, the Jews are this racial mixture. So you can see, I mean, how far we are with the conception that the Jews are part of the white people. But that was, I mean, this Nordicist kind of ideology was very widespread in the late 19th century and early 20th century. American writer Kenneth Roberts, who's known as novelist and the rest, wrote this in 1922. The American nation was founded and developed by the Nordic race, but if a few more million members of the Alpine, Mediterranean, and Semitic races are poured among us, the Mediterranean included, the result must inevitably be a hybrid race of people as worthless and futile as the good-for-nothing mongrels of Central America and Southeastern Europe. So you can see what kind of racial configuration you had in those kind of minds. This led, of course, to the, I mean, this climax of horror that the Holocaust, what we call the Holocaust or the Shoah. But the Holocaust was such a climax, such a culmination of this hatred and horror, that it was a defining moment in what has been called, the expression not from me, the whitening of the Jews. This is the moment where this happens most radically. There have been quite a few studies of that, including in the country where the Holocaust was, I mean, the perpetrator country of the Holocaust. In this country here, a book like Frank Stern's The Whitewashing of the Yellow Badge, Antisemitism and Philosemitism in Post-War Germany, published in 1991, originally a PhD thesis at the University of Tel Aviv, is an excellent source on that, on the story of the relation between Germany and the post-war, post-45 relation between Germany and this topic and the rehabilitation through the support to the State of Israel. I would also recommend the book by Daniel Marveski. Disclaimer, he was I was his supervisor, but the book called Germany and Israel, Whitewashing and State Building came out 2 years ago. So we have this. We have also the same. You can find studies about the United States. I would quote an excellent book, the one by Karen Brodsky, How Jews Became White Folks, and what that says about race in America. It's a very interesting book, not only about the topic I'm discussing, but exactly about the issue of racism more generally. And she describes this evolution in the book. Let me again here read a quote. American anti-Semitism was part of a broader pattern of late 19th century racism against all Southern and Eastern European immigrants, as well as against Asian immigrants, not to mention African Americans, Native Americans, and Mexicans. These views justified all sorts of discriminatory treatment, including closing the doors between 1882 and 1927 to immigration from Europe and Asia. This picture changed radically after World War II. Suddenly, the same folks who had promoted nativism and xenophobia were eager to believe that the Euro-origin people whom they had deported, reviled as members of inferior races, and prevented from immigrating only a few years earlier, were now middle class, and therefore part of the white people, if you want. Hollywood was a major contributor to this whitening of the Jews. Look at the representation of the Second World War by Hollywood. I mean, of the Holocaust. How many Haredim have you seen in films, Hollywood films, about the Holocaust? How many people looking differently than normal white Europeans in their way of dressing and the rest? I can hardly think of any. If I'm wrong, you'll tell me about one, but anyhow, this must be, if there is, must be a real exception. The image is that of white people, Jews represented just as, assimilated Europeans. Holocaust, the TV series of 1978, the representation of the Jews that were at the center of the series is exactly this, middle class, or even actually one of them, the German-born wife of the Dr. Weiss in the series is descended from Hochdeutsch family whose ancestors were ethnic German court Jews. So that's the kind of representation that you have. I would say that even here, I don't know if it changed, but I was personally shocked when I visited the Jewish Museum in Berlin of the representation of the Jews, where you have big sections on the KaDeWe, on Jewish capitalists, if you want, and even unexplainable things like, I remember a picture, a photograph of a countryside-looking, if you want, woman, and under that, the pearl. And what has this to do with a Jewish museum? The explanation is Jewish middle-class families had housemaids, which they called the pearl, but that was, I mean, the general kind of term used in the Jewish, in the German middle class. So this representation, and look at the contrast between that and the very little corner. That was when I visited, it was a long time ago, actually, I should say, devoted to the workers' movement, the Jews in the German workers' movement. And speaking of that, and since I mentioned about the Negroids, we have with Marx and Lassalle, the two most famous figures in the Jewish socialist movement in the 19th century, two dark-skinned Jewish Germans. Marx was nicknamed Moor, that is the Moor, and he wrote, ironically, I should say, about Lassalle, that Lassalle must be a descendant of those Negroes who joined Moses in fleeing Egypt. So that gives you the kind of idea that I'm trying to convey here about this whitening of the Jews. Now, with the Holocaust, you had a real tabooing of anti-Semitism. And it became, in Europe, a real taboo in the global north to a certain extent. Peter Novick in The Holocaust in American Life described it in one formula quite aptly, I would say, said, the Holocaust came to symbolize the natural and inevitable terminus of anti-Semitism. First stop, an anti-Semitic joke, last stop, Treblinka. That became a full taboo, and it has been, I mean, this conference, there were comments on the fact that the reaction against anti-Semitism is very, very different than what you have towards other form of racism. And that led to the view also that, like the one expressed by Aimé Césaire from Martinique in his discourse on colonialism in 1950, where he speaks about precisely this issue, the tabooing of anti-Semitism and the perception of the Holocaust among the Europeans. And he says, well, what you can't forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself. It is the crime against the white man. the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the N-word of America. I said at the beginning, I speak as something recent about that. Well, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, you may have read the story that you had in the United States, the reaction to Whoopi Goldberg comment about the Holocaust being white people doing it to white people. Now, this view, the one expressed by Césaire, I'm not going to comment on Whoopi Goldberg, is partly wrong and partly true. It's wrong in believing that that was, in the conception of the time, white people doing it to white people. No, the Jews were not regarded by the perpetrators as white people in that sense. And this whitening of the Jew is a consequence of the Holocaust, not something that preceded it. Now, where it is true, it's where he is right, is about the importation of colonialist procedures applied in Europe. And here you have, indeed, a huge, I mean, seen from the global south, it's absolutely obvious that there's double standard, Western double standard in dealing with forms of racism. I'll give you one of the worst chapters in the history of colonialism in Africa, which is the Belgian colonialization, even the appropriation by the Belgian king, Leopold II of Congo. There have been studies about that, estimates going up to 10 million Congolese, black Congolese, being killed, and absolutely atrocious stories. Even there are some documentaries, even film documentaries, which are hard to watch, the level of violence. And yet, the King of Belgium was just 3 days ago on a visit to Congo, and look what he has to say about that. He expressed his deepest regrets. For what? How did he describe what happened? A regime of unequal relationships, inherently injustifiable, marked by paternalism, look at that, discrimination and racism. It gave rise to exactions and humiliations. Just imagine Angela Merkel speaking to the Knesset about the exactions that Germany perpetrated. I mean, this is absolutely appalling. And that's what you get. We have to keep these issues, I think, very much in mind. Now, Zionism made use of the Holocaust very early on. There was a question about that. From the very beginning, that was the case. And why so? One of the key reasons for that is indeed that Zionism was dominated by left-wing current at the beginning of the State of Israel. It was creating a settler colonial state at the onset of the age of decolonization. So you had to find other explanations, other justifications. And the one founded was, of course, related to the Holocaust, without getting into a discussion about the Zionist movement's attitude towards that. Tom Segev described this quite well. But there was the use of the Holocaust there, first by the Nazification of the Palestinians, using the figure of the Mufti, Amin Husseini, the ubiquitous villain of the story, about whom there is much more in European languages than you can find in Arabic, I can tell you, for having written a whole book on that. The Nazification of the Palestinians by using the Mufti, that had at least some kind of connection to reality, in the sense that the Mufti indeed collaborated with Berlin and Rome after 1941. And of course, the Holocaust Israel as a redemption of the Holocaust was a key justification used by the Zionist movement at that time. And this would develop into philo-Semitism among the Western left for a whole period of time in history. The Western left had also this philo-Semitic kind of position that we have seen here in this country after 45 for reasons I don't have time to get into. The figure of the pro-Zionist, if you want, left, European left, was Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, as a key figure here at that time. And to understand this whole thing, including to understand the mentality of the left-wing Zionist, you have to read Albert Memmi's portrait of the left-wing colonist and the mentality of the left-wing colonist by Albert Memmi. That applies here very well. Now, the shifting point here was 1967, the June 1967 war, and here Nazification was applied not to Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti, but to Nasser. Nasser, one of the heroes of the Global South, of the Third World, as it used to be called. And that is a key moment, again, in the evolution of the place of the Holocaust in Western memory, as Peter Novak, whom I mentioned, very well analyzed the role of the 1967 war. And there you had a shift where the right wing will become the pro-Israeli, if you want, and the left will become critical of Israel. And here you shift from Jean-Paul Sartre to a figure like Noam Chomsky, as, if you want, as a kind of symbolic intellectual in that regard. Next stage, 1977, when the Zionist far right comes to power. The heirs of Jabotinsky arrived to power in the election in Israel and have been ruling Israel ever since, most of the time, with very few years of exception, with the return of the labor rights at some point. And it has been mentioned, but the 1982 war against my country, I'm coming from Lebanon, another disclaimer, was also a moment of this Nazification, which is a misuse of the Holocaust, again, against the enemy. Avram Bug this morning mentioned that. I have the exact quote because that was here, of Menachem Begin writing back to Ronald Reagan, who expressed some concerns about the civilians in Beirut at a time when actually many Jews, many survivors of the Holocaust were shocked by the spectacle of Beirut under siege by an Israeli Jewish army. And he wrote back to Ronald Reagan saying, I'm quoting, "I feel as a prime minister empowered to instruct a valiant army facing Berlin where amongst innocent civilians, Hitler and his henchmen hide in a bunker deep beneath the surface." That's probably the most grotesque use of the Holocaust in the history of the misuses of that. This moment of trying to use it, but it failed to a large extent. That was the most divisive war in the history of Israeli wars. In Israel itself, seen by a huge part of the population as a war of choice, which nothing justified. And that was another key moment in the deterioration of Israel's image, which would lead to an intensification in the uses, the misuses of the Holocaust. And what is the background here now? I get back to this combination of economic crisis and migration. That's what would happen again. 1 century after the first one, the 19th century, in the 1970s, you had the first major global recession since the Second World War. And this, with the combination with the issue of migration, will lead to a resurgence of the far right, of the European far right, and also in the United States later on. And this will be aggravated later on by the Great Recession, as the economists called it, of 2008. It's no surprise that after 2008, you have such a big surge in far-right movements all over the world, actually, not only Europe or the United States. But this is connected here. And you have this development with the far right of this anti-global South kind of attitude, anti-black for sure, anti-Muslim, or I mean this kind of racist attitudes against the immigrants of the day, those who are in the position that Eastern European Jews were in a century before. And this was captured by the right wing in trying to justify its general position here, the mixing an anti-Arab, anti-Muslim discourse with the anti-immigrant one. And you have the development of this theory of the so-called new anti-Semitism. And what is the new anti-Semitism? It's opposition to Israel, of course, or anti-Zionism, of course. And who is holding, who represents this new anti-Semitism in Europe? Not white people, that becomes marginal. No, the migrants, the Muslims, these are the new anti-Semites. You see how it evolves. And this was codified also, the working definition of anti-Semitism, elaborated by the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, which will become, exactly as it is, without any changes, the definition adopted by the IHRA, which had been mentioned several times during this conference. And all this will culminate with Netanyahu, his open alliance with the Western far right, the far right, which has hardly hidden anti-Semitism, white supremacist far right, supporting the anti-Obama, which, Obama personalizes this mixture of black and Muslim. Barack Hussein Obama, of course, and that was part of what the right in the United States, Republican right, very much put forward, and that's what Netanyahu contributed to in this anti-Obama kind of position. Trump, up to Trump, of course. I don't need to speak here about Trump. Orban, Viktor Orban, the anti-migrant, anti-Semite, but whose anti-Semitism is coded like anti-Soros, and whose anti-migrant and anti-Muslim is open. And that's what you had. So, just to conclude, because my time is over, I think that if I were to define a common denominator for the people participating in this conference, I think it's, because the term has been actually used several times, it's in the debate on the lessons of the Holocaust, universalism versus particularism. The common denominator here is the universalist interpretation of the lessons of the Holocaust. And actually, the particularist interpretation, whether it's called never again to us, the Jews, or, if you are not Jewish, never again to the Jews, but okay for the rest. This particularist interpretation is contradictory with the very notion of never again, because there is the only way to eradicate that, I'm converging with things that have been said here, is the universal eradication of racist and ethnicist discrimination and oppression. That's the only way to a real never again. Thank you very much.